Rats.
Yes. I was saying to Saugata that it really is about rats. There are no metaphors here.
I cherish that. Yeah.
Is our second speaker also here, or will she join a little later?
She'll just be joining us. Until then, over to you, Sakshi.
All right, I believe Saneya will be beginning the session.
Hello, everyone. I welcome you all to this plenary. We have two speakers, and the chair for this plenary is Professor Saugata Bhaduri. He's a professor at School of Language, Literature, and Culture Studies at Jawaharlal Nehru University. He has been a distinguished fellow and visiting professor at multiple universities over the world. He has been a part of numerous international collaborations and consultancies, ranging far and wide. He has also served on the boards of several editorial committees. I mean, if I begin, we will not have enough time to count all those. A few things I'd like to mention here. A session was held in his honor at the 7th Neuro-Humanities Colloquium on neuroethic, neuroaesthetic, and neurocomplexity at the Ibero-American University, Mexico City in March 2012. He has also had an associateship at Indian Institute of Advanced Study, Shimla, for pursuing a research project, The Body in the Mind-Matter Dialectic, a comparative study of modes of ontological tripartition. His specializations and research interests include contemporary literary and cultural theory with focus on post-theoretical developments, classical Indian philosophy and resultant literary and aesthetic theories, contemporary popular culture, Western philosophy and its implications on ideological and cultural production, and the theory and practice of translations and comparative literature. So we are glad to have you with us today. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Saneya, and thanks to the organizers for having me and for this wonderful session. And we have, in a way, been moving towards this session because evidently we cannot possibly discuss globalization in the terrains of consciousness today without also taking the post-humanist turn, so to say, and to talk about human-animal relations and animals as companionate species. We've, in a way, been moving towards it because in one of the plenaries, Manoj NY mentioned directly the human-animal relationships, especially in revolutionary configurations today. Yesterday in Tom Moylan's keynote address also, a question drew him to the Thulucene and to talk precisely about the move from the Holocene to the Anthropocene and the Thulucene, etc. And today also there was a question with regards to how non-human animals and non-acoustically can also be part of movements and part of agitations. So we've been slowly moving towards this, and it's but fitting that we have this session as the last of our academic sessions. In fact, it is plenary session number 7, which, as I saw in the schedule, is session number 7 on the 7th. So I think there is a lot of let's say, coincidentality also going on here. But nevertheless, let me welcome the two speakers. And our first speaker is Radhika Subramaniam. And Radhika Subramaniam is a curator and writer with an interdisciplinary practice. Through text, exhibitions, and public interventions, she explores the poetics and politics of crises and surprises, particularly cities and crowds, migration, walking, art, and human-animal relationships, which is precisely what she'll take us today through. Rat, as she pointed out, being not just a metaphor here, but really in terms of whether we could cohabit rats and humans together and other such aliens, so to say. She's the recipient of a Culture and Animals Foundation grant, an international visiting curatorship at Artspace Sydney, etc., etc. And she has been an artist writer in residence at several other places too. And she's currently associate professor of visual culture at Parsons School of Design and the New School, which is in New York, and where she was also the first director and chief curator of the Sheila C. Johnson Design Center from 2009 to 2017. And she has also been the founding executive editor of the Arts Politics Journal. And in her let's say a plethora of works that she's produced. What is particularly interesting is that currently she's working on this project of a creative nonfiction project, which involves an elephant embassy, or rather, to be more precise, Abul Abbas, who was an elephant gifted by the Abbasid Caliph Harun al-Rashid to Charlemagne, and to what extent that elephant would have therefore played. And that book is tentatively titled, as I understand, Elephant's Eye, eye as an eye, but that probably we'll get to hear of at some on some other occasion. Today she'll be talking about rats. So over to you, Radhika.
Thank you so much, Saugata, and thank you for wearing the Abul Abbas shirt, as you put it, with elephants. I'm going to ask Zahra just to share a few slides at the outset, because I want to set the stage a little bit for what I'm going to talk about, and it might help just to see a few images. So this image won a National Geographic Urban Wildlife Award in 2019. It's an image of rats in a tree pit on Pearl Street in Manhattan, I guess conversing with each other in some way, engaging with each other with the ubiquitous food source garbage cans or garbage bags at the back. The next slide. And then this slide and the one next to it is part of what, in a sense, prompts the paper that I'm talking about, which is a campaign by New York City about coexistence with wildlife. And you'll hear a little bit more about it when we get into the paper, but I wanted you to see these images. And if you could show me the next slide, the images thereafter as well, which gives you a sense of the nature of the campaign. This is taken from their website, but the campaign itself appeared, for example, on taxi cabs, in the subway station as posters, and was part of an ongoing campaign of indicating that city dwellers in New York could take many different forms, not just the human one. And then the last slide, if you would. And this is a sanitation campaign, also by the city of New York, taking the form in certain neighborhoods, such as Bedford-Stuyvesant, of garbage cans, which are intended to be particularly rat-proof. There are very few things that rats cannot actually get into, but this was an attempt to create rat-proof garbage cans into which people could place their garbage. And I guess there is a last slide, and that's more by way of introducing all of you to the sort of technical names. So the next slide, please. So this is actually what I will be talking about, and it's a prepared text, and so I will read it. But I wanted you to see the name for those of you who are not biologically or zoologically inclined, that the rat, really the worldwide rat, is the Rattus norvegicus. There's also Rattus rattus, there are other rats, but the Norway rat is the rat that we find, also called the brown rat, is the rat that we find in most places in the world, most certainly in most urban contexts, and it is the predominant rat species in New York City. So with that, I'm going to ask for the screen share to be turned off, and I'll just turn to the text. Thank you. So this is an open letter from Rattus norvegicus to the city of New York. Your continued exclusion of us as urban residents prompts us to communicate openly with you. We do not typically respond to every one of your actions and characterizations. If we had to answer every criticism and vilification leveled over the years of your aggression against us, we would have little time to get on with the ordinary business of living, which is our fundamental concern. You recently determined, through the city's wildlife coexistence campaign, who you would embrace as a fellow inhabitant. On the one hand, your new formulation reveals the rare possibility that you might embrace all who live here as city dwellers. And on the other hand, it renders its clear horizon, relegating us once more to the status of an unwanted intrusion. We are stung to the quick by this refusal to recognize us as residents of this great city you call New York. We have another name for it, which we do not include here, as it would escape your pronunciation. We refer, of course, to the awareness and education initiative called Wildlife NYC that the city administration initiated in 2016 as an effort to encourage humans in New York to live alongside residents of other species. The campaign website still has its encouraging statement, quote, "It's no surprise that we encounter animals everywhere, from our parks and green spaces to our roads and roofs. After all, they're New Yorkers too," unquote. In the announcement of the program, the Parks Commissioner noted that it's, quote, "important to understand your neighbors, even the feathered and furry ones," unquote. Challenging though it may be to share your world with other beings, the website notes, the initiative aims to motivate people to be, quote unquote, better neighbors and work towards coexistence. We noted that we did not appear in the photogenic images of this campaign. The very next year, in 2017, the mayor threw $32 million at a new rat reduction plan, a considerable step up from the previous effort in 2015 of $2.5 million, and in a pernicious display of bloodlust, demanded more rat corpses. Still, as we have said before, your bellicose campaigns are not new to us, and we did not pick up the gauntlet. However, when the mayor adds that, quote, "We refuse to accept rats as a normal part of living in New York City," unquote, we must answer more fully. We make no more than a passing mention here of the fact that only days prior to this pronouncement, New York City had reaffirmed its commitment to being a sanctuary city, welcoming and inclusive to all. We're fully cognizant that this commitment was not intended for non-humans, and in any case, for many of us, the managed regimes of sanctuary spaces in which we are asked to live under your continual supervision and surveillance is far from appealing. You must admit that accepting as largesse a well-bordered land with a strictly administered way of life in the name of protection or conservation from those who destroyed or disrupted our lands and lives in the first place is more than a little galling. We raise the question of this commitment to sanctuary here in order to say that evidence of boundaries and conditions to such a concept reveal its limitations. You must not take us as naive. We're not unaware of borders. We draw our own territorial lines within which members of our colonies socialize, greet, forage, share, quarrel, groom, and huddle together in companionship and warmth. The modesty of our size also means we must be alert to danger, and if necessary, our spirit rises to the occasion. We're not mice, after all. But we do not imagine that the world contains no one but others of our kind, and it has appeared neither sensible nor seemly to draw a line around us alone. Before we go too far, let us establish ourselves as city residents. Like many of you, we are originally immigrants. The stories of coming over are now a part of our folklore, passed through the thousands of generations that have called this city home. So far back does our arrival go that if we entered ourselves into ancestry.com, we would find that the downtown clans of Manhattan are genetically distinct from the uptown clans. Like many immigrants, our name has been bastardized, and this Latinate appellation that we now carry is a complete misnomer. We have no special attachment to Norway, as is suggested by Norvegicus, except that some of our ancestors passed through and some relatives remain there. Our origins are actually on the Asian steppes, where distant kin surely still live out their lives. But for most of the Rattus Norvegicus diaspora, this too is in the hoary past. You might think that it was this Norwegian misunderstanding that got us here, but the story of our travels and arrivals is actually not about preferred immigration categories or racist exclusions. Truth be told, we'd rather be called brown rat and cast our lot with those who are as little desired as we are. But the necessity for recognition within your systems means that we must use every mechanism at our disposal, including an embrace of this ornate nomenclature. As to why we are here, We are where we are because of you. By nature, we don't venture very far. It may come as a surprise to some of you to learn that there are very few self-styled adventurers and explorers among our kind. Most of us live and die within a block of where we were born. We learn the lay of the land in which we find ourselves, its roots and resources, and we traverse it enough to grow comfortable. Next time you walk out, keep your eyes down. You might see the sebum-marked routes that are the navigation systems of our city. Most of you never look where you tread, your eyes avidly questing ahead, but we are thigmophilic. We like to touch. We feel our way using our bodies, fur, and whiskers rather than our eyes to shape and map the city. Perhaps this difference between us explains why, unlike us, you can blithely step out, propelled towards things you've never seen, towards places you haven't encountered, grasping at what you don't know without asking and with scant regard for who or what else might be around. No rat, however, ever hitched a ride on a trading caravan or stowed away on a ship, hoping to be dazzled by new vistas or unexpected morsels. We don't like putting ourselves out where our whiskers can no longer sense the edges of our unknown world, of our known world. But sometimes edges move and extend. Gaps get created, often by you humans, so that we followed the stability of that orientation. To point us out as intruders in these new worlds is to obscure your own colonial sebum trails. We prefer to stick with what we know and have known, and we have known you a long time. Your propensity to wander is renowned. So is your tendency to be both fearless and careless in ways that invite and even demand the involvement of others. You are our familiar. Having established our antecedents, let us return to your Coexistence campaign. We commend you for finally acknowledging the many other species who are fellow inhabitants of this city. We've always been perplexed by your belief that cities are an exclusive construction. Of course, we applaud the inventiveness and creativity that brought into being these majestic assemblages of stone, wood, brick, and glass, the resources and technologies often powered by other species that seem to raise castles in the air, even as their infrastructure plunged deep below. We have sampled many of these innovative designs and found them to be marvels. But your conviction that these are solely your environments from which you can invite, exclude, extract, and control animals, birds, and plants according to your fancy has always struck us as misguided. Earth, sky, and water are held in common, and they cannot be proprietary even when you harness their powers. In any case, despite the disinvitation, we urban non-humans moved on and moved in. Pigeons in the plazas, ducks in the parks, squirrels in the backyard, cockroaches in the kitchens, sprouts in sidewalk cracks, trees in empty lots, and so on. Some you see every day, and others remain just a bit out of sight. Our Rattus kin sought harborage in the subterranean spaces from which we conduct our business mostly at night, although in a city that never sleeps, we are not hidden. In your admirable and benevolent campaign, you invite humans to learn more about their cohabitants. Your introductions are sympathetic. The eastern coyote is, quote, adaptable and resourceful, like any New Yorker, as is the raccoon. Don't judge raccoons for out foraging for a meal, you caution. They're only, quote, doing their best to get by, unquote. The much maligned bats you elevate into superheroes, caped crusaders who swoop through the air to, quote, vanquish those who would do New Yorkers harm, unquote. Not surprisingly, your greatest admiration is for the fierce red-tailed hawk, our own nemesis, coexistence with whom you describe as an ideal. Is it because you share a spirit of independence or are filled with an ambition that soars as high? No, your disappointing reason is that the hawk provides free pest control. As every rat or pigeon who has felt the cold shadow of that wingspan and fled for cover knows, the hawk has an unblinking indifference to such judgment. Who is the pest? You say we are. You laud the adaptable, resourceful qualities of city life. These are some of our qualities: tough, quick-witted, doing our best to get by like every other New Yorker. Yet we remain a nuisance to you. You can't find any merit in our proximity. We are not alone in your list of pests, of course. You dislike insects too, on some of which the bats swoop at night, and yet others barely stay beyond the brink of your disapproval. The director of pest control for the city's health department once said, referring to us, quote, "They're just like us. They don't give anything back. They eat and reproduce," unquote. Now, the director doesn't move in our social circles, so he's obviously unaware of the finer points of our Norwegica's culture. If he did, he would learn that we value living and accord being itself a central place in our philosophy. Even the most existentialist among you is caught in the give-and-take economies you inhabit that instrumentalize life. You acknowledge that giving is a virtue, yet you applaud the cleverness of those who take. You measure the city and its species largely by how they further your aims. Hawks and bats are pest controllers. Deer and ducks are aesthetic. Dogs are both security and therapy. And trees provide ecosystem services. This way of thinking is anathema to us, but you, it appears, have looked in the mirror only to see reflected in it us, but without our philosophy. It isn't the first time that we found ourselves becoming vehicles for your attitudes and politics. We have been the target of your ire for a long time, the perceived source of incivility, disgust, and disease. In vain have we pointed out that the plague bacillus kills us too. It's because we die that the infected flea hops onto other warm-blooded bodies such as yours. But we don't say that you might never have caught something from us. Sometimes, as we know, it's better to keep a social distance and not get too close. But infectious vectors cannot be subject to moral judgment. We are not harbingers of doom. It's ironic, though, that it is our own kin in laboratories who are working with you at the forefront of scientific and medical research. Granted, you've engineered their environment and genes to make them manipulable for your purposes. But word gets out from time to time from the lab rats, closely guarded as they are, so that we know the truth about both their servitude and their contribution. The day such news arrives is a sober one for city rats. Familiarity, we've come to realize, is not always safety. Too long have we carried the symbolic weight of your hatreds and suspicions. Which of us can forget how you converted our snouts into noses, using each caricature to expend your deep anti-Semitic venom? Once Jews and rats were interchangeable, technologies of extermination could be applied to both of us. Kill one as you kill the other. We have borne the effects of your campaigns of terror, stuck and starved in your glue traps, clubbed and attacked, bleeding internally by the anticoagulant warfarin, even as some of us thankfully developed a resistance to it. Relief from some of your more poisonous efforts has actually come from the unlikely intervention of the hawk or other predators who also sickened and died from indirect ingestion. In your desire to protect them, you had to turn to other methods whose effects couldn't be passed on. Time and again, the objects of your revulsion and xenophobia take form as us. Migrants and foreigners crossing the border suddenly turn into rats in the media, overrunning the national space as past citizens and residents. Our fecundity has always been a strange source of fascination for you. Almost every article about us has a back of the envelope calculation of how 2 rats can turn into more than 1,000 in a year, or what the ratio is of us to you. You win, but apparently that isn't enough. We hope you can respect that reproduction is a private matter, but we can assure you that the demographers among us have never found that our population was in excess of available resources. If you find us in your homes, walls, and gardens, you must ask yourself, what drew us there? Did we create substandard housing? Did we fail to make repairs and create friendly gaps and cracks? Are we responsible for your disregard of poor neighborhoods or for your housing and sanitation policies? Cast your mind back to New York in the 1960s. Robert Sullivan's excellent book about our history in New York gives a full account of the massive rent strike organized by housing activist Jesse Gray in Harlem. Neither the landlords nor the city had paid the slightest attention to the needs of the tenants of these tenements. We were in the buildings too, largely minding our own business, although a bit giddy with all that was easily on offer. We confess we were enjoying a bit of a standoff with the residents. As a tactic, Jesse Gray told the tenants to catch rats and take our corpses down to the eviction hearings. Some tenants also wore rubber necklaces made of rats. The media and public went crazy for this political theater. The tenants went further and called the politicians, city officials, and landlords two-legged rats, in contrast to our four-legged variety, so that we were simultaneously symbols of neglect as well as its agent. Shortly after, the city passed a $1 million rat bill. Thus, we became an alibi for callous disregard and racism. Blame the rats. Easier to exterminate them than to examine your own structures and policies. While Gray was organizing and encouraging the tenants, he referred to them as rats too. Quote, "The tenants are like rats now. Rats feel their power and they come out in broad daylight and just sit there. Once tenants feel their power, they stop running and they're not afraid anymore." Unquote. You must admit this is a real symbolic roller coaster. Are we the abject revelation of wanton disregard, or the evidence of racist constructions of filth and squalor? Are we the wily, uncaring landlords and officials, or the tough and determined face of resistance? You talk through us, using the instrument of this protean conception of filthy vermin and recalcitrant pest to enact your political agendas. We have had enough of this ventriloquism. We do not want to live in your image. We are tired of being caught in the mirror of your forms of loathing, of yourself and of others. We reject outright the category of pest, but we also refuse to be invited in as your guest. As we have pointed out earlier, the conception of cities as designed by and for humans is a type of colonial fiction. No city has ever run without the power of animal and plants behind it. We Rattus have kept our eye on you from the start, insinuating ourselves early on, lest you imagine that this place, any place in fact, can be free of everyone but you. In so doing, we have borne the brunt of your aggressive cleansing campaigns and your symbolic transmogrifications. We understand better than most the daily impact of living alongside you. If we repudiate so much of our joint history, what are we asking for? It may surprise you to learn that we are not asking to belong to your political community. We're not asking for the right to stay. We insist rather on the reality of being. We wish your Coexistence campaign had not tried to make wildlife into New Yorkers, but rather let New York be a wilder place. We wish you had let the city open up to the differences of its many species. Coexistence is not an idle experiment to be savored in the mind. It is tangibly forged through the flesh, smell, and proximity of others. Nowhere is this brought home more clearly than in the daily lessons of the urban sensorium. Many regular New Yorkers already see us as part of city life. Amongst those who idly watch us on the subway tracks, for every person who throws something at us, we feel the sympathetic gaze of 5 others, occasionally curious, often preoccupied, and tired of being alongside each other on a crowded subway platform. We venture to suggest that today's city is as much an attitude as it is a material formation, one that must contend with its density, promiscuity, and difference. If you are ready to recognize the many species who live in this city, we encourage you. Such recognition does not come by admitting those you carefully select for entry. It requires considerably more courage and imagination. We know we are this city's resident aliens. No, this is no application for immigration, but is about our coexistential status here. Ever intimate, ever strange, ever present. There is no city in the world without us. Respectfully yours, R. Norvegicus. Thank you.
I guess, as is the usual practice, the rapporteurs will read out some of the questions that are there in the text box. That should be how we go about it, right?
Yes, yes. The first question that I can see here is by Professor Zino Ackerman. He asks, he says that the last comment, however, might raise a question. Would you, Professor Subramaniam, see your paper as an instance of strategic anthropomorphism?
I think that's a good way of putting it. I hadn't thought of it exactly like that. But yes, I have both been interested in anthropomorphism in the sense of providing the impetus, if not the analytic tool for reaching across outside humans. So insofar as it evinces that kind of movement outside, it strikes me as a very useful one. I thought very hard about whether to write this as an open letter and what it meant to allow rats to frame a statement that was very much within a certain kind of structure of human interaction, but not within the rights discourse, with which I have considerable problems. The idea that, in a sense, rights are granted, because one of the things the rights discourse does is not allow those whose languages and ways of being simply don't fit the political space and always demand that someone else speak for them. So I was trying to find a mechanism for the rat to enter a human vocabulary, but in a very guarded way. And so I will, if you don't mind, use that as one way of describing it. It's very productive. It's a very productive phrasing. Thank you to obviously to Gayatri Spivak, who precedes that kind of strategic formulation. And thank you very much, Zino.
Next, we have a comment as well as a question by Namita Paul, who says, perhaps a conversation with the rats of Deshnok, Bikaner, Rajasthan will reveal another worldview.
I have no doubt. Are we referring to the rats in the temple, Karni temple, or is that, I'm not sure if that's what that refers to. Yes, okay. Indeed. I do think that some of this is framed within a certain, but which I think is true of cities. So some of this is framed within a 19th century, the construction of the 19th century city as a particular kind of Western city that began to exclude. So rats themselves, even in the Western city, didn't turn into sort of demonic, pestilential others until the 19th century. So although people had some connection to the plague, the rat forms itself into a certain kind of being in the Western city. On the other hand, I do think that there's a way in which cities often characterize themselves in opposition to non-humans and bear them on sufferance, even though there's obviously no non-human, as I've made clear, could give a toss, and they're always part of this vocabulary. The temple rats, as also rats in a more rural area, obviously raise other issues. I think some of the rats in the temple are actually Rattus, the black rat, which is the Indian rat. But that's, that may be just putting too fine a point on it.
All right. Professor Bhaduri, shall we take one more question? Because there is sort of a couple of question in the chat box. Do we have?
No, we have a lot of time. As per schedule, we're doing fairly well. We have 5 more minutes to go till Francesca's presentation. Francesca's talk is supposed to happen. So we have a lot of time.
All right. Soma Vasu asks, Dear Professor Subramaniam, your writing has always inspired me since I read Culture of Suspicion and In Search of the Indian Cow. I'm a new MPhil student and my question may seem silly. Question number 1, how do you classify your writing in the academic scheme of things, if you like to classify them at all? How can I defend my thesis paper to my seniors who perhaps cannot imagine that academic scholarship can be liberating too? And thirdly, what about human gaze, if I may call that, when voicing a rat, and isn't this appropriation?
So that's a lot of questions, and it's a difficult. So there are two parts of it. One. Let me take the last one because I hope that in part the response or the suggestion and productive response to Zeno Ackerman suggests that this is not necessarily appropriative. That this is not an attempt to ventriloquize the rat, but is rather a way to open up a discursive space that is very much within human formulations into which we might allow a rat to imaginatively enter. One of the things that interests me a great deal indeed is what happens in the sort of edge or boundary zones between species. One kind of response is to say the ontological or epistemological difference is absolute, and there is no way to bridge it and cross it. And there's obviously a truth in that. But what interests me much more is the desire, certainly on a human part and on my part, to continually strive at that edge. That is, how do you, and this to me, and this may be one way of getting back to the first part of your question, first two questions, which is I take that to be the business of a research enterprise. How do you deal with a research project which will never result in complete knowing, that where you have no illusions of total knowledge, but you always strive towards some sort of desire to hold something up closer to you. Anyone who is, whether you're a scientist or a social scientist, anyone who believes that that scholarship and research results in the apprehension of something in its entirety is misguided, to my opinion. And the human-animal boundary is perhaps the most charged in that, because we have ventriloquized them, we have spoken for them. So I hope that in some way answers the appropriative question. To the first two regarding how do you tell your professors or seniors, you got to work at it, because I think you have to find your way, and each of us will do it differently. You have to find your way to understand that the form of the thing is as important as what you're saying. And maybe that is That's one thing I've certainly learned from working more as someone who works more in practice, as a curator, as someone who is is a practitioner and not just theory in the head, that the making of something reveals other things, and some things are revealed only in the making. I can't write, for example, until my fingers are on the keyboard. I have no idea what's in my head. They come through my fingers. So I hope that an attention to form, not as a sort of silly aesthetic frippery, but rather as something that actually constructs the objects of inquiry, to realize that how you construct knowledge is very much in the way in which you approach it, might be one way for you to find, I think you put it as a liberating route to academic scholarship.
I guess, as it always happens, now more questions are flowing in, but we have to probably stick to the time. And so I guess that Radhika could probably respond to those questions on the text box. Most of them are complimentary comments rather than questions. And as far as ventriloquism is concerned, well, there is an image of the talking rat to rat on someone, to rat out someone. So we have had, even in our metaphorical, though negative, albeit negative constructions of the rat, we also have the talking rat, one who snitches, one who tells on someone. And which is so relevant in these days when apparently there are cyber volunteers who are supposed to rat on you on a day-to-day basis. But thank you very much, Radhika. And I'm really sorry to Isabel and all the others who have put in such questions there, but we have to move on, I guess. We are still doing well with time, but we will not if we do not bring this to a close here. So with everyone's permission, we must thank Radhika for this wonderful presentation, and we'll move on to the next presenter.
Thank you. Thank you to everyone.
Thank you so much. So we move on to our next speaker for this session, who is Francesca Ferrando. And Francesca Ferrando teaches philosophy at NYU-Liberal Studies. And she is a leading voice in the field of post-human studies today. And she's the founder of the Global Posthuman Network. She has been the recipient of numerous honors and recognitions, including the Sainati Prize from the President of Italy. And she has published extensively on these topics, her latest book being Philosophical Posthumanism, which came out from Bloomsbury in 2019. She has also been named as one of the 100 people making change in the world by the US magazine Origins, which is truly fascinating. And we are looking forward to listening to Francesca. As I'm given to understand, this particular presentation would actually be a conversation where Shraddha, one of the organizers whom we have been meeting over these last 3 days, would engage Francesca in a conversation. And so there'll be a formal conversation between Shraddha and Francesca to begin with, and then there'll be audience questions depending on how much time we have. So thank you very much, and over to you, Shraddha and Francesca.
Thank you, Professor Bhaduri. I'm also delighted to welcome Professor Ferrando to our conference. And it has been an engaging 2 days of the conference, and now we are almost coming to the end of it. And here, Bhaduri said in one of the sessions that we were anticipating, as we sent out our call for papers, that we will be talking about the post-human today in the conference. And we have with us Professor Francesca Ferrando, and I have some questions that I would like to pose to her and would seek her response on those. So before I begin, Professor Ferrando, do you want to say something?
Well, first of all, I would like to thank so much all of you for this fascinating conference. I would like to thank also Professor Radhika for her beautiful, beautiful presentation and a lot of synchronicity. And I was listening yesterday to some reggae music, and I do love Bob Marley, but at one point there was this song that I really liked, the Rat Race. And I thought, I always loved that song, but now with the post-human sensitivity, I was thinking, are we okay when we talk about the rat race as something negative, connected to animals that we are not, because we are human animals? And it was so fascinating that today, actually, Radhika was answering a lot of my questions. So, thank you so much, Radhika. Thank you so much, Professor Saugata, for beautifully sharing this conversation. And thank you so much, of course, you, Professor Shraddha, for engaging me in the conversation. I'm very, very, very excited to be here.
Thank you so very much. And I will begin with, I think, one of the most important questions when we discuss anything in the ambit of the post-human, which is to discuss the human as a category, and which has never been one. The human has never been a category in itself. There are pluralities in terms of gender, race, location, class, caste, among many other differentiating factors. Does posthumanism seem to overcome this differentiation according to you?
Thank you so much, Shraddha. This is actually at the very core of the whole posthumanist discussion. In fact, the human is not so much seen as something that is given, but as a process of humanizing. If you think about it, and of course now this is an etymological linguistic perspective, but if you think about it, the term human itself is kind of new, comes with the Romans, connected to the Greeks. But if you look at the big picture of humans, we've been on planet Earth for much, much longer. The Paleolithic time is 99% of our time on this planet. Now, when we look at the history of humanizing, we look at the history of supremacy, in which a group defined themselves as humans and defined the other as the non-human. In fact, even at the very beginning of this conversation that starts, for instance, in Greece with the anthropos, which becomes the reference point for the Romans, they were very fascinated by the Greeks. So the term, of course, is Roman, humanus, which means connected to the humus, to the earth, but it comes from the Greeks. And according to the Greeks, not everyone is human. On one side, if you're a god or a goddess, you could not be human. If you are a non-human animal, you're not human. But also if you are a barbarian, meaning all the people who did not speak Greek. And in this dichotomy, which simply means a rigid duality of civilized versus barbarian, we still see our conversation today. In fact, a lot of wars, think of the war in Iraq, were done in the name of barbarians, or they are the barbarians and these other people are the civilized. Now, we have to really be very, very aware of the fact that the process of humanizing has never, since day number one, been a comprehensive one. And of course, it just keeps repeating in itself with different groups of people. Now, we have groups nowadays that are still not recognized as humans. Think, for instance, I like to be located in the present, and I like to think COVID-19, and COVID-19 has been an intense experience, but devastating more specific communities that didn't have access to social distancing and all these other elements that would protect you from getting COVID-19. So it is very important to realize that, of course, on one side, it's not that we can just get rid of the notion of the human, because it is also working for many people as a connection. It makes people feel good, say, oh, in the end, we're all human. But we have to recognize that this does not come from a history that actually flourish in those specific terms that we want to assign to the term. So in this, more than say, okay, we just keep the human, is a warning about not repeating the same issues over and over and over. So now maybe, I like to go a little bit to the future in order to understand the past and the present. And the point is that if we don't look at the history of the human, the risk is bringing the same issues to the future now with other terms. So for instance, now it's not humans that are discriminated, but are, well, obviously non-human animals, as we were mentioning in the discussion before, but also technological beings. So it is very important for me, not so much to extend the privilege, but starting from a point of existential dignity.
No, absolutely. I mean, I agree with you on that. And this kind of makes me think, we have a lot of indigenous populations and we have a lot of post-colonial populations like ourselves, who in recent history were not even considered human enough. So in that sense, where does our academic turn towards the post-human, take us?
That's a very, very good point. So I would like to say that, of course, we always have to be realistic. In order to really understand what's happening doesn't mean that we can just assume that what we are seeing is validating for everyone, because everyone is different, come from different perspectives, and we're still all together, all related. And I like always the example of the ocean to understand the human species, or even more to understand existence. In the ocean, you have all these different elements, like the seaweeds and the fish and the rocks, and nowadays even microplastics, and they're all part of the ocean. And they're all intertwining with each other and also affecting each other. in different ways. Now, in that sense, so we are as a species. So we're all different. We can look now in the conference, we look different, we have different ideas, but we are all one as well. We're all one species that we are flourishing together. We need others even to survive, even to just exist. We come from DNA of other humans who were before us. In order to survive, we share food and water and knowledge with other people. We are social beings as well. So, of course, we are one and many at the same time. Now, connecting to what we were saying before and to your beautiful question and very important question, is the fact that the effort of the people who nowadays are trying to get recognized as humans. And this, of course, open a lot of possibilities. We're talking about rights, protections. So we're talking about, for instance, indigenous communities, ethnic minorities, but also women. There are many categories that still have not been fully granted the status of the human. Of course, it's fully supported and fully, I would say, embraced by posthumanism. But this is not to, as I was mentioning before, just to keep partaking in the privilege. It's not to say, okay, now we extend our privilege, we open the doors to another group of people and we close to other groups of people. And when I say people, I'm not necessarily referring just to humans. And I want to be very clear about this. I think that the point here is existential dignity and understanding that we are really, really all in this together. COVID-19 in this sense, it's really clarified this point very well. The virus doesn't really see someone as Indian, Chinese, Italian, female, male. Of course, as I was mentioning before, because of human hierarchies, some groups have been affected more by the virus than others, but this is not by the virus itself. The virus, for the virus, we are a species on some level. So I would like to say that we have to be always realistic. And not just saying, okay, now we can just jump to the posthuman and leave the human behind and come with a whole new spectrum of things. Nothing come out of nowhere. We need to be really aware of our roots in order to flourish. And in that sense, I think that there are many movements that can be considered posthuman. They go under the umbrella term. There is posthumanism, transhumanism, anti-humanism. There is a lot going on. But I see, for instance, one of the weaknesses of some of these movements, specifically transhumanism, not really focusing enough on the past. Transhumanism does a very good job jumping to the future. And they see a lot of interesting opportunities about possibilities for the bodies connected to science and technology, radical life extension, avatar, mind uploading. There is a lot to be discovered and to be imagined as well. But I think that one of the weaknesses of the transhumanist movement is really not acknowledging the power of the past, because time is not linear. It's not that we can just go to the future. Time, in that sense, it's very interesting, the idea of time as a cycle, time as a spiral. We are the past, are the present, the future is already here. So there is no way we can build different futures if we are not aware of where we come from. Otherwise, as I was mentioning before, many of the same issues are just going to be repeated to different groups of people. So I think that here it is very important to really try to see our intention and what are we trying to manifest. Because if we are just trying to manifest different technical objects, we can do that, but that is not any solution. I think that the only way to really changing what needs to be changed is having a comprehensive picture of all the elements at play in this big cosmic game that is Lila. And if we do that, we realize the interconnection of existence. And we realize that it is extremely important to recognize everyone as human, but it's also very important not to stick with now the human as a privilege, which is the history of humanism, because humanism is strictly connected to anthropocentrism. So there is no way we can just say, okay, now everyone that is biological human is human, and we can just keep that duality in separation from non-human others and thinking that we can keep the privilege. We cannot keep this privilege in the Anthropocene because it's not good for us. So even to be selfish, the message is we cannot be anthropocentric no longer. There is no longer space for anthropocentrism. I think at one point, maybe there was space where maybe, humans were at risk of extinction. Think of the Paleolithic time during the Ice Age. Although they were not very anthropocentric, maybe they could have had some reason. maybe, you know, some of the ancient texts were written in anthropocentric terms, but maybe at the time humans have very different lives. They have, you know, like much shorter lives, a lot of diseases. They were prey to other animals. Now the picture is very different. A lot of humans still live in poverty and still die very young, but we as a species, the number one reason of extinction for us as a species is human action, or actions that are caused by human action. So at this stage, to be realistic, to be fully realistic, and to be also selfish, to also think of us as a species, the only way we can go on in a safe way is really deconstructing our anthropocentric mind.
Thank you for this long comment here, because it ties in with Professor Radhika Subramaniam's plenary session as well, where she delivered a letter written by the rats, you know, so to say, and gave the agency to the rats. But then there were questions in the chat box which kind of make me think as well about the role of the human as far as enablement is concerned, you know. With respect to our conversation that keeps going on in posthumanist discourse, you know, ontologically as well, where we talk about all beings on the same plane. Also, you know, Rosie Braidotti and Catherine Hales, they talk about this kind of classical humanist notion of subjectivity, which kind of coincides with conscious agency. So I'm talking about agency and subjectivity and its place in post-humanist thought. And I would like to hear what you have to say about this.
Thank you so much. Those are very important questions. Maybe I'll start from the first one that also connect to the conversation before with Radhika, and then I can go on to the second question. So yes, you're right. We are talking about epistemology. And when we talk about epistemology, we need to recognize that the human is the voice that is naming others. There are many traditions we can bring as an example. One is the Garden of Eden, in which Adam is given the power to give names to animals. And from this religious background comes Linnaeus, 1758. He wrote many times the same book because he was really fixated on categorizing everything in a way that was dignifying for God. And he was a very Christian devotee. And he's the one who coined the term Homo sapiens. This was done in Systema Naturae, the book that he kept rewriting in all his life. I'm saying all of this because, of course, when we talk from an epistemological perspective, and if anyone is not coming from philosophy, epistemology simply means how do we get knowledge? Because we can ask what is, a big ontological question, ontos, the being, what is? But then there is a connected question. So how are we asking this question? Because there are many ways we could answer. One answer could be silence. All the mystics would say, you don't need to talk. Once you're talking, you're restricting your answer. Now, if we go into a scientific, academic perspective, you need words, you need to be in dialogue with others, and you realize that the only voices that have been accepted until now, it's already changing with algorithms. We're already in dialogues with non-human others. But until now, the only voices that were naming others were humans. So you're very correct in this. If we go from a strictly academic perspective, we can see that there is a limit there, which is the limit of human understanding. And also, of course, if we go from I would say, ordinary experience, we can also see another limit, which is the human embodiment. So the way I experience existence is probably different from a rat, because I walk differently, I eat different things, I connect to different people, I have a different lifespan, etc., etc. So this is all true, but it's also true that if you think about in deeper ways, what makes a rat also makes who I am. What makes me is also what makes the water and the air. If you think through physics at the quantum level, then this perception of strict dualities really faded away. So I would say that there are many ways to address this question that, of course, is going to connect also to your second question about agency and subjectivity. But let me just finish the first point and then we go to subjectivity, and they're very related. So I would say, if we are going to discuss from an ordinary perspective, we can say that, yes, we always have to be acknowledging that we are speaking from a specific situated embodied perspective that come from us as humans. So we cannot generalize, to everyone else what is our own experience of life, of this planet, etc., etc. In fact, when we look at all the documentaries about humans, they're always talking about us as the most greatest intelligent being, but probably for many of the non-human animals that got extinct, if they had to define in non-human terms humans, they would probably not see us as so enlightened. Recently, the last white rhino died in Africa. Probably white rhinos would not think of humans as so great because they got extinct because humans killing them to get their horns. So I would say that it's very important never to generalize to others what is our understanding of them. And in that, of course, post-colonial studies is a great resource. Let the subaltern talk, Gayatri Spivak. So instead of just saying that, so this is one part of the discussion. The other part of the discussion comes with the second question, which is about subjectivity. And you're very right, there has been quite a discussion about subjectivity in the post-human field. Catherine Hayes, Rosie Braidotti, many have been discussing the notion of the liberal subject and the notion of agency. I'm going to place myself in this discussion and then I'm going to give you my own take on this. Actually, I'm writing my second book, which is precisely on agency, so I've been thinking a lot in these terms. So on one side, the classic humanistic liberal subject that would place themselves as a neutral, universal voice to speak about others is gone, is long gone. It's already gone from the 70s. Postmodernism, post-colonial studies, critical race studies, feminism, all of these studies has really demonstrated that that voice was not a real universal, if there is something is universal, objective voice, but it was the voice of one strict group. You can say, like the hegemony, if you want to go into Gramsci, the hegemony, speaking for everyone else. So you have a group that now places themselves as the neutral voice that is going to tell others who they are. Now, that is long gone. It's being recognized that that doesn't work because I know myself better than other people do. So instead of other people telling me who I am based on categories, I can probably tell them who I am based not on categories, but on experience. So it's a much better idea, not asking people who I am based on my gender or race or ethnicity, but telling them who I am out of my 42 years of experience on this planet. So that has been really the core teaching of all these important fields that flourished from the 70s on. There is another layer here that I would like to address. To me, this doesn't mean that we go into solipsism. And solipsism doesn't, again, if you're not coming from philosophy, simply means the idea that we can never get really to others because we only know what we know. Solipsism means that I'm just assuming that you know, but I can only know that I know because I'm not you. Well, that is again a type of strict dichotomy in which the self is separated from the others. But life, existence, doesn't teach us this. Existence teaches us that we are all connected from the very beginning. And if we look at very young kids, I would say probably until age 4 at least, if you ask them who they are, or even let's go even a little younger, 2 to 3, they have no answer to that question. They would just look you with open eyes. They're not going to use a gender, they're not going to use a nationality, they're not going to use a race, none of that. They don't know who they are because they are everything. They are not going to understand your categories that you've been taught in school to understand because they don't work to those categories. So I would say that when we come to this planet, we're fully open. Now, it doesn't mean that eventually we just get, it's not a positive and then it's a negative. It is the path of experience of life. But someone like, for instance, like Nietzsche says the overhuman, he calls the Übermensch, the overhuman is that human, the adult, who can go back to a mind of a child. I would say not go back in the sense that you just forgot who you are, but passes through all the stages. Passes through the camel, just accepting what society gives you to learn about society and about other humans. Go to the lion, the one who rebels about all of this and say, I don't need any of these. And then get to the child who is able to play, who is able to be in the cosmic game of Leela, going back to a Hindu notion that I love, knowing it is a game and knowing that because it is a game, we can change the rules, but we need to know the rules to begin with. So in that sense, I would say that yes, the idea of the subject versus the object is long gone. The idea of agency become an open agency that is not just conscious. Catherine Ells recently published Unthought, so the idea of all the agencies that have not been considered as such in the history of at least Western philosophy. And for instance, she refers to other traditions like meditation, saying we can really learn a lot from different traditions that have not been recognized as scientific. So I would say it is very important to always locate ourselves. It is very important to know who we are. And in order to know who we are, we need to start from the self, start from society, start from the species, start from the planet, all of these levels together, not in a hierarchy, because we are all of these.
Yeah, it's a very important point that you're making, because I think not just for a 3 or 4 year old, but also for all of us, sometimes it's very difficult to define who we are unless we fix ourselves into certain kind of context. So it's a very, very difficult question to answer, definitely. Now, just reflecting upon, how we conceived the call for papers for this conference and how we came about, and all the 3 days that we've spent together with our wonderful plenary speakers, with our keynote, special keynote addressees, with Professor Appadurai, and now we have Professor Chakrabarty's address. We are kind of moving towards a thought which involves climate change. We are talking about biodiversity loss. We are talking about, like you mentioned as well, COVID-19, the outbreak of zoonotic diseases. So is the post-human world, according to you, a world of shared vulnerabilities?
It's a great question. Yes. And that doesn't mean, again, I would like to go beyond good and evil, the positive and negative. Is just yes, not judgmental yes, for many different reasons. Well, first of all, as we were mentioning before, when we think of who we really need to take all of this in consideration. So we are, yes, individuals. We are part of a society. Yes, we are. We are part of a species. Yes, we are. We are part of a planet. We are not living on planet Earth. We are planet Earth. I like very much here the metaphor of Zen philosopher Alan Watts, who says to talk about the human, think of an apple tree. The apple is coming out of the tree. Now think of the human. We are like apples. We literally come out of planet Earth. We are not just living on planet Earth. And this is going to be very clear where humans very soon are going to migrate to Mars. According to NASA, humans were going to migrate to Mars in 2029. I guess with COVID-19, now things have shifted a little bit. But the idea is that humans are going to move to different planets. Moving to different planets means that the human is going to adapt to different planets, because the human at the moment, as we are with our biology, we cannot survive on Mars. We need external technology. But now think about 3 generations, 4 generations, think 10 generations, think 50 generations of humans have been living in Mars. If they don't come back to planet Earth, they're going to develop into different species, obviously connected genealogically and genetically to the human, but something different. They are going to be fruit of Mars, another type of being. Now, I'm saying all of this because it is very important not think of us as living on planet Earth. Because if you live in a house, you do anything you want to the house. But if you realize that you are the house, then maybe you take better care of that. Now, when we think of us as the planet, we realize that whatever we do to the Earth comes back to us. I always like to give this example because it's very real. I am 42. When I was a kid in Italy, people who came out with the news that they had cancer, it would come into a tragedy. People would cry, it was so bad, people were desperate. Now, people talk about cancer like, oh, what kind of cancer you have? It's normal to have cancer. Not saying it is a good thing or a bad thing. I'm just being realistic here and saying that cancer is considered now almost normal because we live in a very polluted environment in which the environment is affecting our health. So in that sense, there is no way we can separate the environment from who we are. We need to be fully aware that we are the planet, that we are the cosmos, that we are in relation to all the other beings. That is why when we think of who we are in the 21st century, the Anthropocene has to be at the very core of the discussion. And in that sense, even in mysticism, it is very important to realize this, because of course everything is eternal and universal, but we're still part of a shared experience. Now, in these terms, I would like to talk about vulnerability. And I would like to say that to be vulnerable means that you realize that you are in this together with everyone else. It means that you are permeable. And again, COVID-19 really taught this very, very clearly. It taught us that we can nothing longer just through nations. Okay, now I'm in India, I am safe, or I'm in China, I'm safe, or it doesn't work like that. We are one species. And this, of course, being a posthuman applied to all kinds of discussion, like genetic engineering. You cannot think of genetic engineering some human embryos and just say, oh, they're just doing it in China or Italy or the US. We are one species. If someone is doing genetic work on embryos in Zimbabwe, it's going to affect everyone else. I'm not saying it is good or bad. I think we need to think as a species. We need to open our mindset as a species without judging others, but realizing that we are in this together and whatever others do is affecting all of us. So in that sense, the COVID-19, of course, has been an intense time. And of course, it brought a lot of sorrow, but it also brought a lot of enlightenment. And it also brought the idea that we really realize that we are here and we can die, myself first, I'm going to be gone one day. Even transhumanists who love the idea of loving forever, even the sun eventually is going to shed away. Everything eventually is going to end. So it's not so much the quantity of time. Of course, it's probably nice to have a longer life if we can, but it's also important the quality of life. And enlightenment can happen in one instant. So you don't need unlimited time, but you need to be fully aware. So in that sense, COVID-19 can really work for us as a species to open our eyes, is to start think as a species, connect as a species, and also respect each other as a species and as part of planet Earth, which of course means also including respecting wildlife. Because one of the reasons why we got COVID-19 is because we were not respecting wildlife, because we thought that we could do anything, going to wild areas and kill animals, eat them, not protecting any areas. Think of the Amazon forest, it's being cut every day. Of course, the people there need some form of sustainment. That's why they're cutting the trees to sell them. But the issue is that we have to think in the term as a species, bringing resources to these people so they don't have to cut trees anymore. Because the planet is one and the Amazon are the lungs of the planet. So in that sense, without judging others, but realizing that we are all in this together. And if someone is suffering, and if that's why they're cutting the trees in order to sell them, we need to address this in a mindful and in a compassionate way, realizing that what is being done to others is going to affect us too. And once we don't have the forest anymore, we're all going to be dying pretty soon because we need oxygen, because we are in this together. So that's why it is a very important insight to understand that we are vulnerable. And this doesn't mean that we just need to be afraid, not at all. It means that we fully realize that we cannot think of us in separation from others.
Thank you so much, Professor Ferrando. I am full of many, many, many questions, but I will not take more of your time, and I will pass on the baton to my rapporteurs and also to the chair, Professor Bhaduri, to conduct the proceedings of this session further. Thank you so much. It's been an honor.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, everyone, for this beautiful conversation. Thank you so much, Shraddha, for your beautiful question. Thank you so much, Saugata, for sharing the talk, Radhika for your presentation before, and Deepash for the next presentation that I'm really looking forward to listen to. So thank everyone, and let's be in this together and respecting each other and all the beings that are existing right now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Francesca, and thank you, Shraddha, for putting these questions before her. So this was in any case an extended Q&A session. Therefore, even if we have fewer questions for this session, it wouldn't really hurt us, so to say. But there are, as I can see, around 7 minutes as per our schedule. So the rapporteurs can gather questions from the chat box and put it in front of Francesca. But we will close at 8:20 IST. So 7 more minutes to go for the extended Q&A.
All right. So the first question, I can see here is by Professor Yasmin Arif, who says, Professor Ferrando, in classical sociology, people like Durkheim wrote much about society's worship of itself in the shape of totems. Totems were animals mostly. Taking from there, where do sacred animals fall in the post-human? Or, as a larger question, does the sacred have a place in the post-human? Another point, would you consider the virus a human creation that is responsible for the destruction we see currently?
What a beautiful question. What a beautiful plural questions. Thank you so much, Yasmin, for bringing these points to the conversation. I would say yes. I would say that it is very important not just to stick to an academic background when we talk about the posthuman. I think that there are many, many traditions that never enter the academic discourse because of different privileges. Think that very few humans were taught how to read and write until very recently. So if we just stick to the academic tradition, we're going to pretty much be in a tradition of privilege. So it is very important to be getting out of the field as well and look into oral traditions, looking into all different kind of traditions that were not recorded in, let's say, academic terms or in written terms. For instance, going to the totem and the sacred animals, I think that a very interesting example of post-anthropocentric, or even, I would say, pre-anthropocentric views of the world come from natives cosmologies, and from native cosmologies. An example here is Amerindian cosmologies, for instance. Eduardo Vivero de Castro did some very good work on this. And this is done with native cosmologies in Indian American soil in the Americas, but can be applied to many other native perspectives. And the idea is that, yes, that the animal doesn't see, the animals see themselves as human, which means the animals see themselves as subjects. The animals fully see themselves as part of a culture. In that sense, to be human is not as special, because everyone on some level see themselves as human. And when in this tradition the human is used as a term, it means simply the perspective of the subject. Now, it is also very important that in this tradition there is the notion of the shaman. And the shaman is the being that is fluid, is the being that knows that they go beyond any species, any gender, any race, any ethnicity. And the shaman, this is why the shaman can become an animal, because the shaman knows that the shaman has never been just a human. In that sense, the shaman can connect to different plants. Think, for instance, I'm thinking now of, for instance, Amerindia, the tradition of ayahuasca, in which ayahuasca as a plant is a subject, is talking, is sharing their experience of the world. So to the ingestion, and of course the human has to ask permission before ingesting the ayahuasca. So in that sense, yes, I would thank you again for really bringing this important point. And let's not just stick to academic traditions, because if we do, we're going to be caught in a specific tradition that I'm not saying we should erase it in any way, but it's really just going to be limited as a view. And talking about the sacred, oh yes, I would say that is probably the only way to play this cosmic game with joy is to see this game as sacred. And doesn't mean divine. I'm not saying that we need to get a god or a goddess into all of this. You know, the idea of us being divine on some level can be also a nice game to play. But the idea of the sacred is, I think, the only way that we can play this game without just anger or hate or distress or taking things too seriously. So when we see everything as sacred, we realize it is much easier for us to treat everything with dignity. And I would like here to add technology, because it is also very realistic and the only way to see at least some form of humanity developing in our era through technology as well. So we talked a lot about the planet, but it's also very important to recognize the technological dignity. In that sense, we are part of this. The way we use our technology is affecting technology itself. The searches we do online, our digital prints are affecting the whole network. So in that sense, I would really like to think of us as living our life as sacred, not because someone else is giving this to us, although if this works for you, you can definitely go for it, but from more of a, I would say, philosophical perspective, which is not necessarily theocentric. I would say that think of you in this cosmic game and enjoy the game, because it's all we have. It's all we have.
Shall we conclude the session, Professor Bhaduri, or do we? Professor Bhaduri, I can't hear you. I think you're mute. You're on mute.
has to unmute me. Yeah, right. Yeah, right. So, yeah, I think we are out of time. So there are more questions, I'm sure. Even one that I can see from Debabrata about whether caring for the other also makes us phobic of the other. And those are questions that can be answered by the by, and you can always be in touch with Francesca Ferrando. But we have to bring this session to an end, because in 10 more minutes, we have to move on to the valedictory session. And of course, this session was so important. It was a privilege on my part to have chaired it. And thank you, Radhika. Thank you, Francesca. And thank you to the organizers for almost thinking of this program to move slowly towards what would be more environmentally sensitive. And thank you so much. Thanks to everybody, the organizers particularly, for having me over, and to the speakers and to the audience. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks very much to everyone.
Thank you so much, everyone. It's been wonderful to be together, and also with a posthuman Indian network. You can look it online if you want to be connected, also with the Global Posthuman Network. And I'm so looking forward now to listen to Chakrabarty's speech. I'm a big fan of his work. So thanks so much, Radhika, Saugata, Shraddha, everyone connected today. It's been an amazing conversation. Thank you so much, everyone, for your work that you're doing in this planet together. Thank you.
Thank you, Francesca, and thank you, Radhika. So we do have a break for around 8 or 9 minutes. So we can take a break, and then Professor Deepesh Chakrabarty has already joined us, and we can come back and